The path through the woods was quiet, the air crisp and heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Emma and Jake walked side by side, their hands intertwined as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the trees in long eerie shadows. It was supposed to be a simple walk, a break from the noise of the city, a chance to disconnect and enjoy the stillness of nature. But something felt off. The woods had grown darker faster than they expected, the dense canopy of trees overhead swallowing the last rays of daylight. Even the birds, which had chirped merrily when they started out, had fallen silent, leaving only the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. "Are we still on the path?" Emma asked, her voice quieter than usual, as if she didn't want to disturb the silence. Jake nodded, but his grip on her hand tightened. "Yeah, I think so. It should loop back toward the road soon." They walked a little further, the trees pressing in around them, the air growing colder by the minute. Emma glanced up at the sky through the branches, but the thick tangle of leaves and limbs obscured everything, leaving them in an unnerving twilight. "I don't like this," she said, her voice edged with unease. "It's too quiet." Jake didn't answer right away. He had noticed it too, the absence of sound, the unnatural stillness that hung in the air like a heavy fog. He forced a smile, trying to shake off the feeling creeping up his spine. "We're almost back," he said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. "Let's just keep moving." But just as they took a few more steps, something stopped them both dead in their tracks. A sound, faint at first but unmistakable, a soft, muffled cry. Emma froze, her heart skipping a beat. "Did you hear that?" Jake's brow furrowed. He had heard it too. It was distant, almost lost in the wind, but it was there, a high-pitched wail like a child crying. It sent a shiver down his spine. It sounded like... Emma trailed off, her eyes widening. "A baby?" Jake nodded, but his mind was racing. What would a baby be doing out here in the middle of nowhere? His rational side wanted to dismiss it as some animal or trick of the wind, but the sound had been too distinct, too human. Again the cry echoed through the trees, this time louder, closer. "We should check it out," Emma whispered, her voice shaky but filled with concern. "Wait," Jake said, his pulse quickening. "What if it's something else? I mean, what if it's... a child?" Emma interrupted, her eyes pleading. "We can't just leave them out here. It's getting dark." Jake swallowed hard, torn between the instinct to run and the sense of responsibility creeping into his mind. If it was a child, they couldn't just walk away. But something about the cry felt wrong. It wasn't just the sound, it was the way it seemed to carry through the trees, too perfect, too deliberate. Reluctantly, Jake nodded. "Okay, but we need to be careful." They followed the sound, their footsteps growing slower, more cautious as they ventured deeper into the forest. The crying grew louder, more insistent, guiding them through the maze of trees. Emma's heart raced in her chest, each step filling her with a mix of dread and determination. The forest felt different now, as if the shadows themselves were watching, waiting. After several minutes they came to a clearing, and that's when they saw it. An old house, barely visible through the thick overgrowth. The roof sagged, the windows shattered, and the walls were covered in creeping vines that snaked up the crumbling stone facade. The place looked abandoned, long forgotten, but the sound was coming from inside. A steady, rhythmic wail, like a child sobbing in the dark. Emma's breath caught in her throat. "It's coming from in there." Jake stared at the house, unease gnawing at his gut. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but the sound was unmistakable now, echoing from deep within the house's decaying walls. "Are you sure we should go in?" Jake asked, his voice low. Emma nodded, though she didn't look entirely sure. "We have to." They approached the house cautiously, stepping over fallen branches and broken stone. The front door was hanging off its hinges, creaking softly in the breeze. Emma pushed it open, the wood groaning under her touch, and the smell of rot and dust wafted out, thick and oppressive. Inside the house was even worse. The floorboards were warped and splintered, the walls stained with water damage and mold. Old furniture, sofa cushions, a rocking chair, a broken table, lay scattered about, coated in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. The crying echoed through the empty halls, louder now, more desperate. Emma took a step inside, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaky. The crying didn't stop. If anything, it grew more frantic, as if the child was trapped somewhere deeper inside. Jake stepped in behind her, his every nerve on edge. "This place doesn't feel right." Emma nodded, but her focus was on the sound. "It's coming from upstairs." They moved carefully through the house, their footsteps creaking against the decaying wood. The air was thick with the stench of mold and rot, and every breath felt like a struggle. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the house itself didn't want them there. At the base of the staircase they hesitated. The crying was louder now, coming from above, somewhere on the second floor. The stairs looked unstable, the banister cracked and broken, but Emma started up them anyway, driven by some deep, unsettling need to find the source of the sound. "Emma, wait," Jake whispered, but she didn't stop. The stairs groaned under their weight, but somehow held as they climbed. At the top, they were met with a long hallway, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper and old picture frames. The crying was louder here, echoing from one of the rooms at the far end. Emma and Jake exchanged a glance. This was it. Whatever was making that sound was just beyond that door. They walked slowly, the floorboards creaking ominously beneath their feet. The hallway was cold, unnaturally so, and their breath came out in misty puffs as they approached the door. Emma reached for the handle, her hand trembling. The crying was so loud now, so close, and yet, there was something wrong about it. It didn't sound natural. It didn't sound like a child anymore. It was too steady, too perfect, like a recording stuck on repeat. Emma hesitated, her fingers just inches from the handle. And then the crying stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, and for a moment, all they could hear was the sound of their own breathing. Emma's hand hovered over the door, frozen in place, her heart pounding in her ears. "Maybe we should leave," Jake whispered, his voice shaking. But before Emma could respond, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the room was empty, nothing but dust and shadows. And yet, the air was thick with the sense that something was there, something watching from the corners of the room. Emma took a step forward, her breath shallow, her skin prickling with unease. "Where is it?" she whispered. And then, from behind them, they heard it again. The sound of a child crying. But this time it was coming from downstairs. They spun around, staring at the dark hallway behind them, the sound growing louder, closer. Jake's blood ran cold. That's impossible. The house groaned as the sound echoed around them, as if the very walls were alive, closing in. The silence pressed down on them like a weight, thick and suffocating. Emma and Jake stood frozen at the top of the stairs, staring down into the dark hallway where the eerie crying had just echoed moments before. It didn't make sense. The crying had come from upstairs, hadn't it? And now it was behind them, down in the depths of the house, the sound bouncing off the walls like some sick game of hide-and-seek. Emma swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her throat. "What is happening?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Before Jake could respond, a sharp sound shattered the stillness. Crash. Both of them spun around, eyes wide with fear. The sound had come from inside the room they had just entered, the empty room, or so they had thought. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the space. Her eyes darted across the dusty floor, over the broken furniture, and then she saw it. A small cup, lying shattered on the ground, its fragments scattered across the wooden planks. "Did you see that?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. Emma nodded slowly, her mind racing. There had been no one in the room. No wind, no movement. And yet, the cup had fallen as if someone, had knocked it off the table. She took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to leave. But before they could turn toward the door, a cold breeze swept through the room, chilling them to the bone. Jake grabbed Emma's arm. "We need to go. Now." But then, out of the corner of her eye, Emma saw something move. She turned, her breath catching in her throat, and her blood turned to ice. Standing in the far corner of the room, bathed in the dim light filtering through the cracked window, was a small figure. A child. A little girl no more than 7 or 8 years old, her hair hanging in tangled strands over her pale face. She was dressed in a dirty, old-fashioned dress, her feet bare and caked in dirt. But what struck Emma most was her eyes, wide, dark, and filled with tears. "Oh my God," Emma breathed. It's a little girl." Jake stared, unable to speak, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. The girl looked so small, so fragile, her tiny hands clenched at her sides as she stared at them with tear-filled eyes. But something about her felt wrong, unnatural. The air around her was too cold, too still, and her figure seemed to flicker in the dim light, like a candle struggling to stay lit. The little girl blinked, a tear slipping down her pale cheek. Her lips trembled and she opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she raised one hand slowly, pointing toward the door at the far end of the room, the one that led deeper into the house. Jake took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to get as far away from the girl as possible. But Emma, her heart breaking at the sight of the child's tears, took a hesitant step forward. "Wait," Jake hissed, grabbing her arm. "What are you doing?" "She's just a little girl, Jake," Emma whispered, her voice filled with concern. "She looks so scared. Maybe she needs help." Jake shook his head, his pulse racing. Emma, this isn't right. We need to leave. Now. But Emma couldn't tear her eyes away from the child. The girl looked so lost, so heartbroken, and something inside Emma couldn't bear to turn her back on her. We can't just leave her. As if sensing Emma's hesitation, the little girl blinked again, her tears falling faster now. She took a step toward them, her small feet soundless on the wooden floor. Her lips quivered, and this time, a soft, barely audible voice escaped her mouth. Come with me, the girl whispered, her voice so faint it was almost drowned out by the pounding of Emma's heart. The room seemed to close in around them, the air thick with tension, but Emma couldn't move. She felt drawn to the girl, as if some invisible force was pulling her closer. Jake's grip on her arm tightened. Emma, no. We have to go. But Emma shook her head, her eyes locked on the little girl. She's trying to show us something. The girl turned slowly, her tear-streaked face full of sorrow, and pointed again. This time toward a door they hadn't noticed before, a small, heavy door at the far end of the hallway. It looked old, older than the rest of the house, its surface scarred and rotting. Without another word, the little girl began walking toward it, her movements slow and deliberate, her head bowed as if she was ashamed of what lay beyond. Emma, despite every fiber of her being telling her to stop, followed. Jake's heart raced as he watched Emma step away from him, his mouth dry with fear. Emma, this is insane. You don't know what's down there. But Emma didn't respond. She was already halfway to the door, her feet moving of their own accord as if she was in a trance. The little girl reached the door first, her small hands grasping the rusted handle. With a soft creak, the door swung open, revealing a dark stairwell that descended into the depths of the house. The basement. Emma hesitated for a moment, her breath catching in her throat as the stench of rot and decay wafted up from the darkness below. But the girl turned back to her, her wide eyes pleading, and Emma felt herself step forward as if she had no choice. Jake, panicking now, rushed forward and grabbed her arm. Emma, stop. Don't go down there. But Emma barely heard him. The little girl was waiting, standing at the top of the stairs, her tear-filled eyes staring up at them, beckoning. We have to help her, Emma whispered, her voice distant and hollow. Reluctantly, Jake let go of her arm, his gut twisting with dread. He didn't want to follow, but he couldn't leave Emma to face whatever was down there alone. Together they descended the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, the darkness pressing in around them. The walls were damp, and the faint smell of mold clung to the air, but there was something else too, a deeper, more putrid odor that made Jake gag. The floor beneath their feet creaked, the wood soft and rotting, but they pressed on, following the little girl's small flickering form into the abyss. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened up into a wide, cavernous space. Old shelves lined the walls, filled with broken jars and dusty, forgotten relics. But what drew their attention was the far corner, where the little girl now stood, her back to them. Jake's skin prickled with fear as he took a step closer. What is this place? The girl didn't answer. She just pointed. Emma's stomach turned as she stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes widened in horror as the light from their phone flashlights revealed what lay in the corner of the basement. Bodies. Dozens of them. Some were old, little more than skeletal remains, their skin hanging in rotted tatters from their bones. Others were fresher, their faces frozen in expressions of terror, their mouths open in silent screams. The stench of death was overwhelming, the sight enough to make Emma's knees buckle. Jake staggered back, his mind reeling. Oh my God. What is this? Before they could react, the little girl turned around. But she wasn't a little girl anymore. Her eyes, once filled with tears, were now black voids, her face twisted into a grotesque, snarling grin. Her skin had turned gray, decayed and rotten, and her small, fragile body seemed to grow, her limbs elongating, her fingers sharp and claw-like. A low, guttural growl escaped her throat as she bared her teeth, her once childlike form now a nightmare made flesh. You've seen too much, the creature hissed, its voice no longer soft and sweet, but filled with malice and hunger. Jake grabbed Emma's hand, yanking her backward as the creature lunged at them, its claws slashing through the air. Run, he screamed. They bolted for the stairs, the creature's inhuman growl echoing behind them.